left in an 06 round. And people gave me some very stern advice. They're like, you really want to be careful. You don't want to embarrass yourself and go winless at the tournament. You should really run something competitive. And what I said, Mr. Speaker, everyone in this house, was nonsense. Nonsense. I'm running my favorite K6 round and be damned about the consequences. Here it goes, Mr. Speaker. We're going to put you in 1916. We're going to put you in my favorite island in the world. And by favorite, I mean not my favorite, but it's Ireland and it's still very cool, Mr. Speaker. The case is very simple. You represent the collective voice of a group of intellectuals and kind of cultural leaders who've been slowly formulating an innovation, a renaissance of Irish culture, literature, music, sports, whatever. They've been bringing it back hardcore after hundreds of years of oppression. Mr. Speaker, as this group, you've generated enough kind of momentum that you're now feeling your wheeze. You now really want to rebel. In history, what happened is this small group of individuals rebelled, and every damn one of them died. We're going to put you as this group, Mr. Speaker. We're going to ask you if you want to rebel or not. But we're not going to put you before you rebelled. We're going to just tell you that magically or however else, you know for a fact that you and every single one of your comrades is going to die. And you magically know that you will not succeed in your rebellion, inasmuch as this rebellion will not lead to a nation state in the time frame of the rebellion. With that said, rebel or not.
Okay, I have a few questions here.
Sure.
So there's this small group that have been bringing back the culture, and these are like the intellectual elite, kind of thing,
right.
or like people responsible.
How large is the group out there?
I'd like this rough. Like,
I mean,
like, is it a lot? Like, would they be getting in other people to help them with the rebellion, or is it like
no,
100
the rebellion is going to primarily consist of this group, and we're going to say that you're going to die, but it's mostly going to be confined to your immediate group.
Okay.
So, I mean, I don't have a percentage of that.
No, that's fine. And then also, are there other people besides this intellectual group that have been focusing on this Irish culture, or are you the ones who are primarily?
I mean, yeah, like the island is concerned that they've been oppressed for the last 500 years.
But I mean, like, are there other people like writing stories, doing things of that nature?
I mean, most of them are illiterate and digging for potatoes with sticks. But if they could, they surely would. And they certainly enjoy being able to be part of it in as much as they can. So
can you, sorry, like, I'm not a history major, I don't know a ton about what was happening in the context of the time. Can you give me, like, the Idiot's Guide to Ireland in 1916?
Right. Idiot's Guide to Ireland 1916 is kind of like the Idiot's Guide to Europe 1916. There was a fairly big war going on the continent. England was part of it. England was Ireland's colonial overlord. England had been oppressing Ireland. There had been some changes in as much as England had liberalized a little bit at this point, but not all the way. Irish were still under English rule. There's a movement for home rule in Irish parliaments. It has not been successful yet. There's some momentum for it, but it doesn't seem to be going anywhere.
Okay, and then so besides to defend the intellectuals not bringing about the rebellion, you're saying if they don't do it now, they never will, or is it just at this point in history off they will?
I'm not saying that at all, but I mean, you can do it at different times, but sure.
Right, so besides it depends on something again.
Yeah, you can do it whenever.
Okay, then we're going to say don't do it now.
Of course you say that. Of course you say that. Of course, Mr. Speaker, at some point we'll talk about why there's no point like the present. But we're going to say on our side of the House that rebelling is absolutely, in every meaningful way, the correct decision in this particular context. The first thing that we'd like to talk about, Mr. Speaker, is the idea of a purpose of a rebellion. And on this, we'd like to talk about, first and foremost, whether or not a rebellion is primarily hinged on consequences. We just don't say that that's the case, Mr. Speaker. So having this magical knowledge that you're all going to die and that the rebellion is not actually going to solve anything, at least in the immediate context, isn't really changing much of anything. Why do we say this? Well, primarily, Mr. Speaker, we say that rebels like to be able to hope that they will have some kind of success. But that's not the primary move that they're making. You see this in the American Revolution. You see this in a lot of different revolutions in the world, where the question isn't so much, am I going to succeed? But the question is, how much am I willing to tolerate? At what point do I say is enough is enough? At what point do I say, no more will I suffer at the hands of the overlord? And in this particular context, Mr. Speaker, we say that that point has absolutely been reached. Why do we say this? Well, the first thing that we say under this, Mr. Speaker, is the oppression is very long-lived. And while this is by no means the same or the first rebellion, there have certainly been many throughout Irish history, we say that a lot of the same motivations are still there. And that from generation to generation, everybody has to recognize that they are unwilling to live under the yoke of this oppression. But the second thing, Mr. Speaker, is that even though some changes have been coming, they've been very slow in coming, and we think that they're actually at a stalemate at this point. Inasmuch as it's kind of stalled in Parliament, inasmuch as it doesn't seem to be going much of anywhere, we think that it is no longer becoming of a rebel, no longer becoming of an intellectual elite who has an appreciation for the autonomy of Irish culture, who has an appreciation for the unique nature of the culture that does not deserve to be enslaved. We say that it is unbecoming of such an individual to continue to go cap in hand to the English and say, "May I have my independence, please? May I have my human dignity, please?" We don't think that there's any way, shape, or form where it's acceptable to go to the oppressor and say, "Give me my dignity." You may take your dignity, or you may be oppressed. We say that there is no middle ground, and anything else is to sell yourself out. The second thing that we'd like to talk about, however, Mr. Speaker, is the idea of the practicalities. And this is answering the question, why now? Because invariably, I think, Mr. Speaker, they're not going to be able to give you a better time. Why do we say this? The first thing that we'd like to say, Mr. Speaker, is inasmuch as there is a world war going on, there are going to be a lot of consequences that are going on now that would not be the case in some other context. First and foremost, your rebellion is going to be far more visible at a time like this. At a time where England is using the might of its colonial empire to harness resources and then focus them on the Germans and the continent, there is no better time to say, "I will not go along with you, oppressor. I will not fight your battles. I will not pay for your battles. I will not go along with what we see to be an unjust war, and certainly one that does not concern us as the oppressors." But furthermore, Mr. Speaker, I think that given the impetus of given the rhetoric that's going on surrounding World War I, making the world a safe place for democracy, kind of the Wilson argument, I think you have a strong chance, inasmuch as you rebel, inasmuch as you send a loud message, to send the message very clearly that you are not being, even though you are part of, on the side of the ally, even though you are a colony of one of the allies, you are not part and parcel to this distribution of democracy. That the people who claim to be fighting in the name of democracy, the British, are in fact oppressing people right next to their own shores. It looks unbecoming to America, who, it might be noted, has a large Irish and German population, to say, hey, we're going to continue to support, we're going to pick sides in this war with someone who's just as bad, if not worse, than the Germans. Yeah.
Right, but if you're these fantastic intellectuals, why don't you write great works about why you oppose the British? Why don't you write great works saying that this is your position instead of just being slaughtered?
Because Matt Spots and Frank Marsico can talk a big game in a pub by a fire with a pint in our hand. The fact is that leaders are not made out of those who can write. Leaders are not made out of those who sing songs. Leaders are made out of the people who get out of their damn chair and do the damn thing when it's required. The problem is, Mr. Speaker, is that yes, the books have been written. The plays have been performed. The sports have been played. But at the end of the day, it's all for nothing if you still don't have your freedom, if you're still laboring under the yoke of this oppression. On their side of the house, they have to advocate someone who's going to write a book and then years later say, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we would have done something? Even if they want to start a rebellion 20 or 30 years down the road, the people are going to say, where the hell were you 20 to 30 years ago? Why were you willing to wait then but aren't now? Now you get to send a message. Now is your opportunity. But the final thing we want to say under this, Mr. Speaker, as regards World War I and why this is so important, is because England, recognizing the dire position it's in World War I, has made the choice to begin drafting individuals into its war, conscripting Irishmen into its war. This is a problem, Mr. Speaker, because if all the other violations of your rights to association, to property, to voting, if all these other violations weren't bad enough, it's impinging on a very basic right to liberty. Not only making you fight, Mr. Speaker, but fight on the side of the oppressor. So our side seems to be advocating a very simple point. On our side of the house, we just say, why are you going to fight and bleed for the enemy? Why are you going to fight and bleed in France or Gallipoli for the enemy, for the oppressor? Why are you not going to just fight and bleed for your own country, for your own patrimony, for your own land? It seems like a simple choice, Mr. Speaker. But the final thing that we want to talk about on our side of the house is the symbolic nature of your death. That we say on our side of the house, you can choose to do a couple, on their side of the house, you can choose to do a couple things. You can choose to go along and hope that the British will hand you your rights. You can choose to go along with it and die in their war. But on our side of the house, you get a couple very important things. On our side of the house, we actually give you something, a way where you can dictate the terms of your own death. That if nothing else, Mr. Speaker, if you can accomplish nothing else by your living and dying, you get to choose the manner in which you live and choose the manner in which you die. That you refuse to have it dictated to you by an oppressor. But finally, under this, Mr. Speaker, we say that you give your country something to strive for. That if you don't rebel now, your country will never have something to reach for. The thing is simple, Mr. Speaker. Talk is very cheap, but only when you have the blood of martyrs actually fertilizing the grounds of your rebellion. Only then do people actually get to come up and say that was something worth fighting and dying for then, and it's worth fighting and dying for now. On their side of the house, it's nothing but a pipe dream. It's an illusion. It's a castle in the sky. We give you something willing to fight and die for that which is your right, and that's what we propose.
Honorable Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Blynn, to open up the opposition part of the bench.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for calling me up here, and MIT for a fantastic night so far. Rebecca for what's going to be a fantastic speech. Interesting case from SiteGov. I always love a PNC, a prepared speech that goes 9 minutes long. Really interesting. I have 3 independent points, unsurprisingly. The first thing I want to talk about is why on their side of the house they are inherently going to be killing off all Irish culture and sending them back years. So I think when they give you construct and they talk about how you're the intellectual leaders, you are the few literate people in your country, the few that have managed to move your country and try and work towards sort of end goals. What actually happens is, as they give you, if you all die, so does everything you have worked for from an intellectual movement, for a few reasons. First of all, you can never hope to teach more people or spread the message in a more meaningful way because your means of doing so have simply gone away. You can no longer communicate with people. But what's also important is that what actually happens on their side of the house is when the British, after working so long and advancing so far, giving it up and allowing the British to slaughter it needlessly means that your culture is inherently set back, not only set back all that time, but it also means that your culture can be, and all your progression can be slaughtered that quickly. What you think is ultimately a far worse message to send, and ultimately is going to show a sort of British dominance over your culture even further. What we actually think you should be doing is sort of motivating your people in a practical way, rather than just rallying yourselves and killing each other off. What we think is more likely to be effective is actually writing works or actually even talking in the pubs or doing things like this. Not just that, but obviously you can have speeches, you can do sort of activist things within your country that don't involve the actual attempt to kill British soldiers that cause this sort of retaliation. The real time to attack, and I'll get to this in a bit, is to actually build up movement, build up your culture to a point where it actually can do so. This goes a little along with the second thing I want to talk about, why waiting for tomorrow is always going to be preferable. So, if revolution is not going to succeed today, but it can succeed in the future, I think the future is ultimately going to be the preferable option for a few reasons. First, we'd say that what actually is going to occur is that with the needless slaughter, I've already explained why it's going to set you back a whole of a lot, and why it's actually going to make people view you as worse. But what we think is actually the preferable option for you to do is actually talk to the Irish people and explain to them what sort of the oppression that the British are doing, and explain why it's particularly pernicious. I think that the real goal is, like, at the very least, work up to a time where it's not a guaranteed death. At least build up to a time where you have a slight chance of succeeding. Build up to a point in time where you have enough people to actually take on the large army of the British. Build up enough time where the British people liberalize more, are more willing to give up their sort of possessions, as they inevitably probably will do in the future. So we think that ultimately will be the more impressive thing for you to do, and also the more successful not this time. Sorry. The third thing we want to talk about, though, is why you're actually going to cause much harm to the rest of your citizenry. So we think what's likely to happen is that if you rebel against the British in such an overt way, and they slaughter you, they're going to rebel right back and punish the Irish citizens to the greatest degree that they possibly can. It's an interesting thing that Spock says, that leaders don't wait for tomorrow. Leaders also don't sacrifice their people for no end goal. Leaders at least wait to actually try and save the day and save their people and end the oppression, not just give it all up at once. What actually is going to be occurring on their side of the house, and this is often seen in international history, that when a part of a group rebels, the whole group gets collectively punished, So not only are you not just making this decision for yourselves, and it's not just a matter of martyring yourself, it's a matter of harming the entirety of your people and putting them at risk, which I don't think is something, A, you should be willing to do, or B, something that would be particularly effective for them. What's up?
Are you saying that there's never going to be a situation where rebellion that there's never going to be some sort of situation where rebellion doesn't entail some sort of risk to the Irish people?
I mean, the difference is we would wait till the calculated risk is not so overwhelmingly harsh on what they even give us on their side of the house. The way to do it is make sure you have a chance of succeeding at the very least. Wait to a point in time where it's not just a mass slaughter of your people, because that's what they're advocating. Essentially, the ability for the British to come in and genocide your people, which is something we should never be okay with. So let's go case side. So the first thing we talk about is that success doesn't hinge on the consequences. And they say, how much should you be willing to tolerate? I think what I'm willing to defend, and I think what Rebecca and I are more than happy to defend, is possibly a small sacrifice of human dignity now, for a long-term ability to actually gain your true human dignity. Because ultimately, in your death, there is no dignity in that. There is no dignity in having your oppressor destroy you utterly, and that's exactly what occurs on their side of the house. Especially when they give you that the cultures are liberalizing and that England is fighting for democracy in general. They're more likely in the future to expand their democratic beliefs, which is something that isn't going to occur if you fight against that now. Because not only does it send the message that you're rebelling, but also if you consider the particular context and if you try and harm their war effort, it means that you are also against this sort of ideology that they're fighting for, which means they're less likely to actually grant it to you. The next thing the spot says is that you shouldn't have to continue to say, may I please have my dignity. And I've already explained that we're willing to sacrifice a little for the long run. But we'd say that also beating it takes away all your dignity. And I think I've explained this a little. That the debt that it actually incurs from you takes away everything you have worked for, all your culture. And that's something that you can never actually get back. If you consider the 500 years that it took to build up Irish civilization and create an Irish Renaissance, are you really willing to sacrifice it for something that at best has some sort of symbolic value, at worst has no value, and at the end of the day actually kills off many of your people, yourselves included? I don't think that would be the case. We'd also say, though, that this is just an argument for not continuing to say, England, can I have my dignity? It's an argument for having sort of rebellious activism without rebellious fighting. And I think there is an important distinction there. There's a difference between your ability to speak up about these things and actually fight about these things. The speaking has the long-term benefits that we've talked about, but it also ensures that you don't mass slaughter. Thank you. You're out of order right now. The next thing that they talk about, I didn't catch tag to their second point, but the next thing they talk about is that it's going to be a lot more visible if you do it in this particular context. Not true at all. The fact if you rebel while they're fighting and concentrating on something they're more interested in, they'll just continue to be more interested in that other fight. They're just not going to take this into consideration. They'll squash it quickly and be like, we're done with this. Let's oppress the Irish people a little more, and then just continue fighting the Germans. I don't think why you're going to be any more visible. But then you want to say you're not that you don't want to be part of the Allies. This is harmful for a reason I've already explained, that this actually may send the message that you're against the sort of things the Allies may be fighting for, which prevents you from gaining any sort of long-term efficacy. But what we also tell you is that actually the writing of the books and actually telling these stories is a better way of doing it. The fact that Nelson Mandela's book came out while he was in jail under the most harsh circumstances to actually pull that off and influence so many people, I think is representative of how a certain group of oppressed people's works can actually get out and influence people in a more meaningful way. What do people not tend to get behind? Rabble-rousers who go to war just whenever they want to actually fight for independence. We recognize in society that war is probably the last thing we want to go for. They're taking it as a first stance, which means that people are less likely to support them. This is particularly harmful if you take into account their next argument they make. They say that there's a large Irish and German population in these countries. If you want to buy their analysis, then the way to actually send a message to these people, rather than just having a small rebellion that gets quashed and no one ever finds out about it, is to write works that can be sent overseas to try and affect change there, which is something they can't get on their side of the house. But then lastly, they say that you're going to draft they are drafting individuals. Here's the thing. England doesn't give a shit if you rebel in terms of drafting individuals. They will still draft them. Here's actually the more effective way to rebel against England. If you agree to the draft and sabotage from within, and actually fight them back from inside, is ultimately going to be much more effective for you, and something that they're discouraging on their side of the house. The last thing they talk about is the consequences of you and death. And they say that it's okay, it's better if you can control how you die yourself. I mean, aside from the fact that this is just an argument for mass suicide all the time, which I don't think is particularly compelling in general, I also think it's just going to be used as propaganda. You don't actually get to control your death, in that even if you control the means with which you die, the message that it sends when you die itself is actually something the British will take a much larger control of. So insofar as you can't beat the British, you can't determine how this message is made, which means that you never actually are seen as a martyr in any meaningful way. What's also important on this martyr argument, though, is that we have to, if you have moved forward and you have been slaughtered, if everything you have done is for nothing, then everything you have done was for nothing. There is no reason to progress. You have pushed your people back. You have tried to move forward for a reason. Don't sacrifice it all in the instance when you will blow it. Wait a while. Save up for the time when it can be effective. Wait till you can actually beat the British. Be opposed.
Here, here.
So I thank Anne for talking about it. Call upon the member of the government, Mr. Black. Here.
Thanks, everybody. These guys for being interesting. These guys for being interesting. Travis for being interesting. And Spots for, at the very least, debating with me for the last 4 years. This is, at the very least, our last in-round. It's been a ball the last couple of years we're doing it. These sorts of cases are really exemplifying. Okay. Massive contradiction in Blynn's analysis. Because when we get to the point about conscription and saying that if you don't rebel right now, you're all going to get put onto the trenches in France and everybody's going to die over there, rather than while you're rebelling, he says that when you do that, you want to sabotage the movement from within. This is funny because then Blynn gets up here 4 minutes earlier and says, you don't want to piss off the Allies, you need all the support from the people that are aligned with Britain, you don't want to piss Britain off. So if they're saying that you want to sabotage the war movement, then that concedes all of the same impacts that he himself argued aren't effective. But the only difference is, on our side, you at least make the statement to the Irish people that this is something worth dying for, that you ought resist the British, and at the very least you are dictating the terms of your own death. You're dying in the streets of your homeland, fighting against the oppressive power, rather than the trenches in France, fighting to defend the exact same country that's oppressing you. With that being said, let's go into his independent views. The first thing he talks about is this whole idea that you're going to be killing your culture. You're losing the intellectuals, and all of Irish history is going to be gone because of this. A couple of responses. First of all, I think while all of that intellectual history is going to be important, I'm going to show you why our side actually strengthens that in the consciousness of Irish civilians. I think what's all the more important is setting a certain standard for action. Because all of the arguments they give you on their side about how even when there is such strong momentum for this sort of movement, for this sort of rebellion, even then you should resist the will of the populace to do so, always tell them to err on the side of safety. But the fact is, there is no point in the history of this movement, and no point in the future of this movement, when it's going to be a give or take matter. The fact is, any movement that you do against the British will cause an irritation, will cause abrasion, will make people pissed off, and make the British crack down on you, just as they have for the last 5 centuries. The fact is, though, our side is the only side that can make the statement that you should continue fighting despite the fact that it is going to be harsh. On their side, when they say you must err on the side of safety, they do in fact have to defend completely acquiescing, because it's never going to be safe. It's never going to be clear when the success is going to be so blatantly obvious, especially when the British have such a vested interest in the Irish community. The other thing he talks about is how you need to really teach others, and you don't want to set back the culture for this. I mean, first of all, I point out that empirically, it seems like the history of Ireland has been, and the culture of the Irish sort of self-determination movement in general, has been sustained through these sorts of broad shows of action. People that are willing to put their lives on the line for the cause. It hasn't been the poetry. No one cared that William Wallace Mel Gibson made a movie out of him, although that didn't happen yet. The fact is that people look at these sorts of individuals as figures, as martyrs, as people that strengthen the idea in their consciousness. And historically, it's been shown that this is what's been sort of sustaining that for their side. But when they try to reject that precedent, when they move further and further away from that, it sends the message in the eyes of the Irish people that the movement no longer stands a chance of success. That this isn't something that we stand a chance of putting our lives on the line for. And while he wants to write poetry, apparently he's going to do this while he's in the trenches of Ireland, of France, fighting the Axis powers. I think our side takes a much bolder statement, and I'm going to show you about it much further when I get into Dan's second final point. Because he says, you really need to just wait for tomorrow. You really need to just show some sort of the possibility of success in the future. I have a couple of responses to this. First of all, huge assumption that this argument makes. On their side, they're presuming that this sort of cultural and intellectual and political capital that you have forcing behind you right now is going to exist infinitely into the future. But it's almost like a blue balls effect in a certain sense, in a very sort of cliche sense. When you try to build up all of this momentum, try to bring people together, and try to make them sacrifice for this for so long, but then there's no release, you literally just keep saying, wait for the future, it eventually just evaporates wholesale, and there's no possibility that you're ever going to be able to get this done in the future. That's the problem. When they concede that you shouldn't rebel when this movement momentum exists, they put it in the eyes of the people that are willing to make this change, that it's no longer worth it to actually fight for this cause, and you can't simply presume that this sort of momentum is going to continue existing that much further into the future. From personal experience, I can tell you that is a fact of the football. The other thing they say is that, whatever. The other thing they say is that the British can liberalize, that the British will liberalize. First of all, they give us no warrant, no empirical claim for why the British would actually give you any of these things. All the arguments they say about how you can just expect the British could change has literally been true for the last 4 centuries, where the British have been stabbing and hanging and drawing and quartering all of your people. So it seems like, and also to sort of belie his own analysis, if the British are going to be so hard to crack down on, if they're presuming that the British are going to crack down on you so hard for this one minor rebellion coming up in Ireland, then what reason would they have to continue giving you rights if they are that antagonistic to your actual cause? No thank you. And the fact of the matter is, I think on our side, we actually give a reason for the British not to continue doing this. We show that it's not actually worth it to keep it if it's going to be such a violent and harsh fashion to hold on. On their side, there's no risk associated with keeping Ireland on, because there's no threat that Ireland poses to the stability of the British Republic. But on our side, we show that as long as there is British rule over this country, they will respond in kind, that there is going to be a problem in terms of British stability that will come from this. But the third and final argument he talks about is backlash, and that they are going to harm others. There's going to be this huge crackdown. 2 responses to this. First of all, it just doesn't seem that practically feasible at this point in time. Recognize that the British are already conscripting Irish civilians to fight the war, World War I. The fact is they wouldn't have the practical capacity to redirect their troops from inside World War I to actually go and fight these troops within Ireland. So I don't think that's a very logical warrant. But secondly, and this is something Spot said that never got addressed, it is in no way politically feasible that the British would be able to do this. Why? Because recognize who the biggest fence sitter during World War I is at this time. The United States. The United States, not all that cool with British colonialism in the past. They've kind of had their own problems with the revolution. When they think that things haven't really changed and the British are still cracking down on people, and when there really isn't any ideal that they're trying to do to support Britain, they might take a look at this and see that this crackdown is happening and say, holy shit, is this really the type of people we want to align ourselves with? Are these really the type of people that we want to support? Our side shows that the British aren't going to be able to crack down on this without making huge sacrifices in the war effort. That's something that only we can gain, and that's why they're not going to win this war. So let's go through the case. First thing we talk about is the purpose of rebellion. And we say that it can't be based on the consequences. It has to be this virtuous ideal that you're willing to resist oppression at the greatest extent possible. They say that there's no inherent dignity in your death, but I think there is a massive dignity in death. You're sending the message to these people that this is something that you should continue fighting for, that this isn't something you can simply turn your back on. And when they say on their side, well, yeah, it's worth it to die for this, but you just have to wait for one at its real risk. Those sort of conditionalities don't really resonate with people in the same way that we are always going to, the same way that our side is able of saying, we are always going to stand up to this repression no matter what it costs us. We are always going to fight for this. That is what creates political clout and future. That is what's going to sustain your movement. We also say that the oppression has been long-lived and the changes have stalled, and you're not going, simply just aren't going to be able to do this on English terms. The English have no reason now, or they won't have in the future, have any reason to actually respond to your activism. This is the other thing I want to say at this point, because the only real response we get from Blynn is this idea that there's a difference between activism and fighting. Recognize what happens to a lot of the activists that go and try to protest for Irish support in front of the steps of Parliament. They're oftentimes treated much in the same way that the actual Irish revolutionaries were. They're not exactly nice to those people in that sense. So it seems very clear that the British have no political will to actually support Irish rights, and they won't have it in the future. They've never given us a reason why that would change in the future. Second thing we talk about is practicalities. And all I want to do here is draw two huge arguments across that Blynn just doesn't understand. First thing is this idea of the message that this sends to America, and they're going to be pissed off and that harms the British in World War I. No response to that. But then the other argument that Blynn just doesn't understand is this argument about conscription. Because he says that, well, no, you can sabotage this. The English don't care if they're conscripting you. That's not the point. The point is that every argument they're making is based on an incomplete comparison. Yes, all of the people are dying on the street on our side, but you're not able to write poetry when you're dead in the trenches in France. You're not able to continue protesting for home rule in Parliament when you're dead in the trenches of France or whatever. What was the other country name? I didn't even know that was country. Gallipoli. So the last argument we talk about is symbolism. I think this is really where our heart of the case lies. Our side, we're making a very large statement of martyrdom. This is something that resonates with the Christian basis for what this movement has come from as well. There's a religious ideology that you're fighting for certain rights that they aren't able to provide for and that the British have been revoking for centuries. On their side, they're simply throwing and smacking in the face of all that has come from this. And the fact is that unless they're willing to completely concede this, unless they're willing to give you some alternative mechanism by which we can gain this in the future, there's no way for them to follow through with that. And you're sacrificing your religious ideals, you're sacrificing your cultural ideals, and you're sacrificing any chance at your own self-determination. We propose.
Followed by the member of the opposition, Rebecca, to close on construction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, so much for calling me up here. Everyone, folks, I think this is a pretty interesting round. I just want to play something off the top of this paper, because I think that there's kind of a problem that develops with this round kind of on the meta level. So they begin by talking about all these really good principled arguments, but then we get arguments from Frank, such as, well, at this time, to be considered legitimate, you have to have killed yourself or been willing to fight. Arguments like, at this point, Irish and U.S. relations were such that they wouldn't be amenable. Arguments such as, the way they treated people on the steps of the Capitol would mean that they would kill you. I think that these arguments, in a lot of ways, do require some level of specific knowledge they didn't provide us with throughout the round, and I really hope they don't collapse on these arguments. But with that being said, I kind of want to talk about our case philosophy today, which is we agree that it would probably be good to have a revolution. But the thing is, we believe it would be even better to have a successful revolution. And we're the only side that can actually give people the tools to actually be able to make any sort of difference and liberate themselves from Ireland. So what are a couple of things that you need to actually have a successful movement? Well, I think one thing that you need is the guarantee that you're not all going to instantly die. I think that's pretty important when you're considering whether or not revolution would be a good idea. What's another thing you need? Strategy. You need intellectuals that can come up with plans that would actually make a difference. People who know how to craft the weapons, motivate the people, do the different grunt work that you can do to actually make this sort of change. When they posit that pretty much everyone but you at this time was illiterate and couldn't really do this, then I think it's very obvious that the only way that in any near future you're going to make any sort of successful rebellion is predicated on the idea that you will actually be able to make some sort of difference. And I think the way you make difference is by having people who can have this strategy. How else do you have a successful revolution? Having the people in general behind you. And how do you motivate the people to get behind you? You don't motivate the people by getting behind you, by just making them afraid they'll be instantly mass slaughtered like you were. I don't think that's very motivating. I think rather what is motivating is putting out great works, getting support overseas by sending your kind of problems and your works over to the United States to get their sort of support. I think those are things that will be much more preferable to their side of the house. And what we're advocating is getting the people on your side, getting them behind you, because they posit the only people who are fighting this rebellion are the intellectuals, and then lead these people in a rebellion. We think it will be infinitely more successful and result in few to no harms. With that being said, I want to move on to our first independent point. And we talk about how you are essentially the only literate people at this time, how you can actually spread the information and prevent your culture from being destroyed. They say that we don't set a standard for action. I think we can give you a few standards that I think are pretty implicit throughout our speech. The first standard is, don't act when you know 100% for sure you're going to die. Don't act when it's going to destroy your culture and everything you worked for. Don't die when you are going to hurt your people in the process and get virtually little to no gain. Those are some pretty clear standards, something we're willing to defend, and something we've been consistently defending throughout this round. What I think that something's really important is that they don't address our analysis that by the British being able to do this, by being able to take out all of Irish culture in one fell swoop, it makes that culture look pretty weak. It makes the Irish look pretty weak. If all of their culture can be destroyed in a matter of days by the British, I think that sends a very negative message to the Irish about their kind of presence, about their culture in general, and which is something that can make them feel like any sort of rebellion in the future would be entirely futile if they're so ingenious intellectuals were just instantly killed. Remember, you don't control what happens after your death. They like to think and they like to kind of assert that everyone will see you as this amazing martyr with all the symbolic value. We think it is very possible that you will have a silent death, where you will not know actually what happens, which is very problematic for them. Then they tell you that you have to have this broad show of history and you have to be willing to sacrifice yourself for people to take you seriously. I don't even know if this was the case at the time in Ireland, but even if it was, I would say certainly that's not the only way you get respect as an author. I think that if you put out great works that motivate people, that's just as great as fighting for a cause, especially if you're willing to fight for it when you know that you won't 100% for sure die, and when you won't get worse implications in the long run, the standard that we've been consistently defending. The second thing they can talk about is wait for tomorrow and why that's preferable, and how you should explain what's going on and build up from within. Their answer is that Frank needs to masturbate more often, essentially, right? Like, that these blue balls will happen. Like, when is the time in history where these blue balls didn't happen, right? The civil rights movement. Like, I think there are a lot of times in history where people learn about their culture, they build up their base, and then they actually fight forward. I think the fact that only the intellectuals are on board here, like they posit, probably indicates that this isn't the logical end. This isn't the only possible way to do this, right? I don't think it's reached its peak. I think that you can move forward, especially if they posit that you've been moving forward for the past 100 years. They haven't given you any reason about why it's going to stop now if you don't release automatically. I don't think that makes a lot of sense in things. So then they tell you that it's not going to change, nothing's going to change, and the British won't change. So I think this is almost a contradiction, where on case they talk about how they're worried about the US going and the US telling them to just let them go, and the possibility they'll just let you go if there's a small rebellion of like a relatively small group of intellectuals. So I don't really see how those arguments kind of mesh on their side of the house. But I think that we tell you that they've been spreading democracy. They even tell you that they've been liberalizing to some degree in case statements. I think those are reasons to believe that you might be able to get effective change if you have a rebellion when you have people behind you. The third thing we talk about is how it's unfair to punish the Irish people. We tell you that a good leader does not sacrifice everyone, right? A good leader doesn't just go and kill themselves. Like the president doesn't fight on the front lines of a war. The reason behind this is you recognize that people have different sort of obligations based on their capacity. We say that these are not the people who should be fighting, but rather we should get better people to do the fighting, while these smart people do the strategy. When the smart people motivate others, it has a much better use of their resources. Then they tell you they won't hold on to you, they might let you go. Like, if because of this very small battle, they tell you it's a very easy kill, you're instantly all wiped out, which I think would very clearly imply that this isn't going to be the bright lines out of Ireland becoming so great and loving you. Sure.
You keep saying things like somebody else. Who else? Where are these other leaders going to come from?
What I'm saying is, you are the leaders. If you are dead, there is no else. The other people we're talking about are the people you talk to the pubs, the farmers, the people who work and are like the proletariat at this point. We want you to rally those people. That's who the other people we're talking about are. People who are not intellectuals and are Irish. That's who we're talking about. I think it's pretty clear. So then they tell you they're going to suddenly let you go, and then they tell you, well, they're going to conscript all of you. Like, I don't know exactly the status of the conscription at this time, but I think that it's very unlikely that they're going to conscript every single person who is of the Irish culture and who's working towards this culture, whereas on their side, they effectively kill them. So then they say there's this kind of contradiction, and they bring it up to the top, but I want to address it right now because I think it's most appropriate here, about this sabotage. So I think there's a very important distinction here that I think is pretty clear. So, whereas if you write books about why they should liberalize, and you do things like try to motivate others to liberalize as well, that's a very obvious action. You're very clearly speaking out to the people, very clearly speaking out against anti-Irish, very clearly speaking to the US. If you just do something from the inside and sabotage when no one knows what you're doing, that doesn't have any sort of negative impact to the movement whatsoever. This contradiction actually doesn't exist, because what Dan's advocating is very small-scale, non-public action in the private sphere, whereas what he's saying is in the public sphere, you should have this very clear auspice of you supporting this. But even if you didn't buy that, I think these arguments aren't that important, and at worst case, could function as an even if, right? Like, even if this isn't successful and you are conscripted, then you can do that. I don't think that's So then they tell you the US won't want to go to England. Again, like, they don't have to know about what's going on, and that we can rebel later too. Moving case sign very quickly. The first thing they talk about is the rebellion in general, and how you look like you're willing to tolerate things. Dan tells you that long-term goals are much more important. They say that it looks like it's something worth fighting for. Like I've already spoken about, you don't control your death. You don't control your legacy. But what you do control is making information accessible, leading people, strategizing. They try to get this idea that there will suddenly be this parade if these people get slaughtered. But I don't think that's the case. Like I think what's most likely is the English are going to publish propaganda saying, look how fast we wiped out your culture. I think that is a lot worse than these people maybe like having positive implications in their death when it's actually not clear. I think what's even more true is people are going to be afraid, saying if these geniuses, if these leaders of industry are just instantly killed, what kind of chance do we stand? I think that will lead people to being much more afraid than it would to empower them in any sort of real way. And if you want to empower them, don't do it by killing off everyone. The second thing we tell you is the leader doesn't destroy their people, and that Ireland may expand their democracy. This really doesn't get engaged. Then we tell them that you can do activism without fighting. They're like, well, you'll automatically be shot. Like, we think that there are a lot of subversive underground literary movements. We also tell you that if this has been building up for the past 100 years and not everyone has already been shot, then we think it's very unlikely that you are suddenly all going to be wiped out to the same degree as all being wiped out in rebellion, which is guaranteed on their side of the house. We also tell you that this activism can happen without this fighting, doesn't really get engaged. The second thing they talk about is the rebellion, how it's obvious it needs to be done right now. We tell you that the British aren't really going to care because, I don't know, maybe they're concentrating in another war at this point. We don't think that this is going to be the right line to where they liberalize and change their policies automatically. They're just going to wipe you out and move on. But then I think we get the most important analysis in the round from Dan, which is Nelson Mandela and similar leaders have written great works from prison, and what they've been able to do is get their message overseas, got their message heard, and got their message listened to. That's something that they never really engaged in throughout the round, and I think is very critical. If not this, just getting your people motivated, you at least have the ability to get over to the United States, because guess what? The potato farmer who's illiterate is not going to be able to reach out to them the same way. I'm finishing up. So, then we tell you the sabotage, which we tell you could do privately if you really wanted to, but it's like really not that big an issue in the round. The third thing they talk about is the symbolic nature. I think it's very important how we tell you this is simply an argument for mass suicide. It means you can control your own death. We don't think it's necessarily a good idea. There are a lot of huge negative implications. Like we think we've proven to pretty conclusively there would be if you all go to war. But we also tell you that you don't control death when you're just being slaughtered, when you're dying at the hands of your oppressor. Because I think there is no dignity in death whenever like they get to tell you oh so eloquently. At the end of the day, we think it's clearly quite bountifully for us. We're very proud of those.
Thanks everybody. Unsurprisingly, two questions I want to ask. The first thing I want to ask is what are the tools of revolution? A few things here. The first is what a revolution needs leaders. And this is where Spot's POI for Rebecca is particularly telling. Who are these other people? Who are these other leaders, if not yourself? And I think that's the biggest problem with their entire case, and something Rebecca points out to start with. That there are no other potential leaders in your country. That your people are illiterate. They are incredibly poor, and they are not mobilizing themselves. What's the significance? When you all go off to lands to slaughter, you all die and leave nothing to help them with. If Ireland is to ever move on, if Ireland is to ever succeed in any way, they're going to need your type of people. They're going to need people who can strategize, who can think outside the box, who are the intellectuals in their society to actually help them out. And this is something they never even attempt to try and get on their side of the house. They're more than willing to kill off not only your culture, but kill off every chance you have of success for the future. On our side of the house, even if you don't think it's necessarily the strongest chance, We give you some chance of success, which ultimately, if you want some sort of rebellion, if you want dignity for the Irish people, the only way to do that is through a successful operation, which is something we uniquely get. What else is successful for a revolution? They say you need momentum, and I think this is really important for us. Because it's not as though, as Rebecca points out, that your momentum just dies if you don't do this right now. In fact, the fact that the momentum has been building, but yet still it hasn't spread to all the Irish people, will imply that this probably isn't the right moment for an attack. And what you do on their side of the house is kill any chance of momentum. Similar to the line of logic I just gave you, that you kill the ability to continue building up and rally your people. I'll talk about that more in a second. They also want you to be a martyr. This doesn't make any sense though. You don't get to control your message as a martyr. You don't actually have any sort of dignity in death. You don't know what the outcome of your death will be. We give you a countervailing standard.
This whole idea about martyrdom wasn't responded to on case. Now
that is absurd. I've been telling you the whole round that there's no dignity in death. We shouldn't lead yourselves to slaughter. I think this is my top philosophy. Okay. So anyway, we say when you can't control your message, and when England is more likely to use this as propaganda, something Rebecca and I have said all over the flow, that it's very clearly that not only is being a martyr not efficient, it's also kind of a stupid idea in general, especially when you know martyrdom is going to, or the sort of impact that would become martyrdom is going to happen. Lastly, under this point of what are the tools of revolution, we think you need help. And this is something if you want to succeed. Clearly they don't succeed on their side of the house. That's what their case is. Let's not succeed and let's die in the process. I think this is telling to begin with. But I think if you want to actually help your culture, the way to do that is not only to help your people and talk to your people and persuade your people this is the right thing to do. Note that they haven't actually done this yet, as Rebecca points out. But it's also to persuade others to rally from an internationalist perspective to actually change. This is the argument I gave you against their second independent point, about how you can write books and send them overseas, about how you can actually make it so that people in other countries are more likely to listen to you by telling of your oppression, not merely leading a rebellion that England is likely to never mention ever happened. And that's ultimately what they are defending on their side of the house. It's a message no one knows. If they know it, it doesn't have any effect, and it ultimately puts the Irish in no better a place. The other thing I want to ask you is, can England change? I think even in case construct, they almost admit this. And I think we give you a lot of analysis actually throughout this round about why England is more likely to change on our side of the house. We'd say that they're liberalizing and they're fighting for democracy. And what's important about this is that when they never respond to our argument about how countries don't like militaristic countries, countries that go to rebellion as a first step, instead of countries that try and work things out in sort of a long-term perspective through talking, through actually not just fighting and trying to kill others. That's when you ultimately send a bad message. What happens, though, is when you try and change England through the methodology that they're talking about, you change Ireland for the worse. Here's how you do it. They are likely to suppress you. They will hurt all your people. They will set everything back hundreds and hundreds of years. We give you two responses. First of all, we tell you that they've been suppressing, that they're going to suppress you no matter what. But we also tell you that if they're willing to divert troops and all these things to squash you to begin with, they're likely to in general. That they seem to have no problem if, as they admit, that you're going to divert troops to squash this rebellion, they're likely to squash your people in the process. This is not out of the question for England. On our side of the house is the only one that gets to defend any sort of protection for the Irish people. We're the only people that actually make sure that your people can stay protected. Leaders don't kill their citizens. Leaders don't ensure that all their people die. Leaders ensure their culture survives. They get none.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The sooner APDA and people in general get off the idea that dying is unto itself the worst thing that can ever possibly happen to you, the better off we'll all be. Death happens to all of us at some point in some way. But the fact is that some of us get to choose the manner in which we live. And sometimes that means we also choose the manner in which we die. I think that's a worthwhile trade on our side of the house, to choose to live free and die in the process, rather than live and wait for a day that will never come on their side of the house. I have three questions to ask. The first thing I want to ask is if not this, then what? Because I think that this is something that's been going on throughout our What are the alternatives to our proposal? Ott tells you, surely, surely not this, because not only will you die, God forbid that the inevitable should ever happen, but your people will suffer too. I think the people argument needs to drop out of the round right now for reasons that Frank just blew off the blow. He tells you that first and foremost, inasmuch as they advocate that rebellion will happen at some point, there's always going to be a backlash. So the points that they're going is not really claiming anything unique. But furthermore, Mr. Speaker, as is going to be eminently clear as an important point throughout this crystallization, inasmuch as America now has its eyes on Britain and Ireland in a way that it will never have again, in a way that Britain needs America, in a way that it will never need America again, they better not be brutal, or they're going to lose the fence sitter that they desperately need in the face of an existential crisis of their own. So what do they have left on their side of the house, Mr. Speaker? What kind of activity? Write books, write poems. If only I had enough time to talk about how ridiculous this is, Mr. Speaker. But we've had 2 speeches to do it, and I think it's just been devastated. Books are great. Poems are great, songs are great, but at some point they become trite, they become hollow, they become manifestations of a pipe dream that will never be embodied in concrete action. There's a reason, Mr. Speaker, that hip people forget all the crappy books that the hippies wrote, because their actual words were not met with actions. There's a reason that people remember people like Che Guevara, not because he was a good person, but because he was willing to act on something, because he was willing to make it real, to make it live, to make it work for people, even those who weren't caught up in an intelligentsia world. Mr. Speaker, I think books are an insufficient answer. But then they say, and I'm glad they let this drop off, wait for Britain. Mr. Speaker, wait for what? Britain's had 500 years to come round, and they're the most powerful empire in the world. They're not seeming to come round. But moreover, Mr. Speaker, I think that this highlights the biggest difference between the 2 sides of the case. On our side of the house, on their side of the house, they're willing to wait for Britain to come round. They're willing to take a handout from the oppressor. They're willing to say, please, we'll take our rights back, whenever it's convenient for you to do so. Frankly, Mr. Speaker, that's unacceptable on our side of the house. Martyrdom, while it sounds absurd, while it sounds irrational, is grounded in a fundamental human desire that the human will never rest until they seize their own intrinsic dignity, that they will never be at home until they grasp what it is to be themselves. We do that on our side of the house, and if it means dying, so be it, Mr. Speaker. We're fine with doing that. The second question I want to ask is, if not you, who? Because they keep saying time and again, leaders shouldn't die. Wait for someone else. They're conspicuously vague on this point, Mr. Speaker, and I think for good reason. Because I don't think they want to confront the fact that a leader is considerably more than someone who writes papers, especially when you come down to a revolutionary movement. No one else can, Mr. Speaker. And I think that that was clear from the first speech in PMC when I told you that not only do you have a unique perspective on Ireland's independence in a way that the Paddy in the field will never have, but moreover, Mr. Speaker, we tell you that you have the unique ability to do something about it, to seize the moment, to organize. Mr. Speaker, we tell you, though, that this is not an advantage that lasts indefinitely. That an inert leader, one who talks a big dream, who looks for a big dream sometime in the distant future, will no longer be a leader. And that when you come knocking years and years later, no one will come to your call because you did not come to their call when they were oppressed, when they needed you most, when they were being drafted, when they were being oppressed. Because you were silent when the people called before, you will not be heard in the future.
Point of order, the idea that the people are asking you for this now and that there will be considerable backlash if you don't act, I think is pretty new.
Here. I mean, I'm pretty sure that I've talked extensively about the fact that a leader needs to be proactive and loyalty of people. I leave it.
I remember that.
All right. But finally, Mr. Speaker, I think we need to look at if not now, when. And I think that so much of the clash in this round is hinged on this point. Because Ott says, wait for a little bit. Wait for a day when you can have a successful rebellion. Wait for the day when the odds are more in your favor. Mr. Speaker, I think Frank destroys this point when he tells you, wait for what? Britain is the most powerful empire in the world and not seeming to be going anywhere. If you wait for the day when a revolution looks like it's going to be successful, you're going to be waiting a pretty damn long time. And I think we tell you this. The question isn't whether a safety will be a given at some point, Mr. Speaker. There's always going to be a danger, and advocating for some rebellion at some point subsumes a lot of the same harms for the danger. But what do we have on our side of the house that they will never have on their side of the house? We have leverage now that they will never ever have again. A way to make a rebellion not just a symbol that will echo down through the ages, but a rebellion that will echo across the space of your own time. A rebellion that will echo across to the United States, sitting on the fence, deciding on which side they are going to enter the war. On your side of the house, you can capitalize on the Making the World Safe for Democracy movement to show that Britain is not where you want to put your eggs if you want democracy, that America cannot substantiate it. If they crack down on you brutally, as they advocate, they have made your rebellion live in a way that they have never intended to. But Mr. Speaker, we also tell you that the need has never been greater. That on our side of the house, we say it's far better to die beneath the Irish sky than to die someplace in Turkey, than to die someplace in France. That's where Gallipoli is, by the way. To die someplace else, fighting your own cause in your own way, and not bleeding in the trenches for the enemy that's not your own. But finally, Mr. Speaker, we ask them, wait for what? Wait till your dreams have passed into insignificance. Wait till you're dying after years of talking a big dream and never having realized it. Your country and yourself demand that this not be something that just exists in song, not be something that just exists in books. If it doesn't exist in reality, if it isn't something that you're willing to stake your life to, then it really means nothing at all. It's nothing more than a shattered dream on their side. We give you action, we give you the blood of the martyrs that has always fertilized the rebellion, and we give you something that will live in perpetuity. For those reasons, Mr. Speaker, we propose.